Mushon Meyer, thanks so much for joining us. We're really grateful. You're kicking off this 2-day series for us. We've got 12 speakers over the 2 days, this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon. So you guys are pioneering the MAUX symposium for us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, John. And thanks to everyone who's part of the MAUX team. And thanks for having us. So I'm just going to kick off, and then I'm going to be followed by Mushon, and then we'll have a little discussion between ourselves. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so over the past 2 years, my friend and sometimes collaborator, Mushon Zer-Aviv, and I have been talking about AI metaphors. It started with me interviewing him for a research project about how AI was perceived in Israel, and then inviting him to give a talk about these metaphors in Israel for a dictionary project, an AI dictionary project that I was doing. So I will talk about both AI metaphors and the AI dictionary, and Mushon will respond to some of this and talk about his work in that context. But what actually prompted this cultural inquiry into metaphors is some of my own work and interest in language and in the making of representational knowledge, discourse, and how it is that the names we give to things actually become things in the world. So there are some interconnected tributaries to this talk, and 3 of them actually. And in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to try and weave all 3 of them together. And I'm going to go backwards in time. So first, I want to start with something called the ethical apparatus, which is the dissertation project that I did and actually submitted 6 months ago, literally to the day today. So, and this image is from this app that's been going around this week, and the title is Ethical Apparatus. So, so this work was sort of about the material and epistemic practices by which a legendary 20th century technology, the car, becomes the stuff of science fiction, and in particular becomes a robot that navigates or drives itself, the driverless car. The driverless car exists as multiple, I say. It is a car, it is a big data infrastructure, but it's also a future imaginary. We expect that it will become a robot. So what happens when you have something that is multiple things is never really one thing. And I found that every time I tried to study this technology and its emergence, I could not escape how language, culture, regulatory frameworks, and histories kept arriving in these different configurations, refusing to let me see it as just one coherent thing. So what I did in one part of this work was to look at how this idea of a singular thing, the driverless car, and its driverlessness was actually being shaped by different kinds of material practices of measurement. And that's where you find the resonance with the word apparatus. I'm not going to go into that in too much more detail now, just in the interest of time. So I started documenting the different ways that we come to think of something as autonomous or driverless. And these are some of the measures. So for instance, the Department of Motor Vehicles in California has come up with something called a disengagement report, which never existed really up until this point. It's entirely made up. And a disengagement report is the number of miles that a computational car can travel before it arrives at something it cannot compute and must hand over control back to the human to make a decision about. The higher the disengagement score, the more autonomous the vehicle is, so to speak. Companies testing in California must report on their disengagements. And then there's the standard. There's the J3016 standard by the Society of Automotive Engineers. And it's a heuristic which has become really popular now, with level 5 as full automation and 0 as no automation. I don't know if you can see the scale in its entirety, but you've probably seen it around in a lot of popular media and tech writing and legislative and policy documents. What's interesting about this is this sort of slow transition from human to machine. And there's the idea is that autonomy is something that proceeds in a linear fashion from now somewhere into the future. This heuristic actually was translated into something slightly different in 2018, into more behavioral indicators. But at the same time, every time I sort of look for the original one, which shows the human at the steering wheel, I find it online. It's still quite sticky. Then we have things like the Autonomous Vehicle Readiness Index by KPMG, the management consulting firm. And this helps countries evaluate if they're ready to adopt AV technology. And some of the indices as part of this index come from research, like how many electric vehicle charging stations are there in a country. But other things are more difficult to identify, like change readiness, or the efficiency of the legal system. And then there are things like the time to reflect reality, which is like a fantastic phrase, fantastic phrasing for actually a technical measure. And this is the time it takes for the map of the world as it is to be refreshed in the cloud and then sent to other cars. Of course, recent other cars that are also driverless. But now Tesla has actually changed this because they have fleet learning technology, which allows cars to communicate to each other in real time about changes happening in the world. So things don't have to go to the cloud and be refreshed. But the measures are not so important to the measures themselves are not so important to what I'm trying to talk about today, which is that they hide all of the material, cultural, and infrastructural systems that make meaning through them of what autonomy actually is. So my work was about showing all of these different kinds of practices that make words and ideas real. And the work of the apparatus, the ethical apparatus, was to reduce these multiple ontologies of robot and car and data infrastructure to one singular thing that we can look at and say, this is coherent as something that is autonomous, as something that is intelligent. And you can read more about it at this paper that I've linked to here. And actually, I've already shared my slides with John. So if anybody's interested, you could always take a look at those. There's references in them. And this is where I take a step back to another project that relates to this matter of language that is more than just words, but our practices of meaning making that we come to accept as truth and fact. So I want to talk about this dictionary project that I mentioned earlier. Is for Another asks, why have we assumed there is one meaning of the word AI, of the words artificial and intelligence put together one after the other? Because the definition of AI in terms of a branch of computer science that attempts to build smart machines that mimic human intelligence immediately implicates what these ideas of smartness, human, and intelligence mean. What else might these words mean, and how does an expanded understanding of these words allow us to think about what AI is and what AI is not? We think of AI as sort of originating in 1956 in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. There's a story that's been told about symbolic versus connectionist AI, Marvin Minsky, AI Winters, Jeffrey Hinton, ImageNet. And then suddenly now we're in a place where machine learning has to distinguish blueberry muffins from chihuahuas. But what if artificial and intelligent actually are open to lots of other kinds of interpretations that are contingent on local histories and contexts of technology development and use? So in collaboration with a group called Design Beku in Bangalore, Pratyush Raman and Padmini Ray Murray in particular, we architected this project, this dictionary of AI, that is sort of prompted by the idea that search is ungenerous. And this is an idea from Mitchell Whitelaw, an information designer. A search bar assumes that you know what you're looking for and you're just going to type that in, just as a conventional dictionary does. Meaning is fixed. So if we want to think more whimsically or politically or imaginatively or speculatively about AI, how do you architect a visual interface that allows you to access a wider archive of knowledge and go beyond the limits of the search bar, or think about other histories and ways of thinking about AI? So the URL is there, asforanother.net, and I'd invite you to go take a look at it and play around with it. In spring this year, I thought it would be interesting to actually expand the dictionary and add new content. And in that context, I invited my friend Mushon to contribute talks based on a discussion about AI metaphors. And the talks were supposed to be a prompt to generate new material for the dictionary, a task that I have not gotten to as yet, but I promise that I will in 2022. So why did I go to Mushon in the first place? Because I'd been doing this project about AI metaphors, as I said, and we'd already had a chat about AI in Israel. And this is the third and final piece that I want to throw at you in this rather dense talk. So it turns out that AI, like driverless cars, is not just one thing, and it's not just the same thing everywhere. How we understand what AI is shaped by these local imaginaries and histories. And I know this because I work with a group of student researchers from 13 countries and working in 9 languages to document how AI was perceived by people in different parts of the world. And you can see some of these on this slide. So I've just got screenshots here of process of documenting what these words mean in different languages. And you can also see some of the metaphors from different parts of the world, which I'm happy to talk about later. But metaphors are more than just poetic flourishes. I'm arguing that they're evidence of these diverse ways that of thinking about technology and the emergence of AI that complicate this sort of, linear narrative we've been told. So I want to actually refer to poetics and politics of metaphors because I'm saying that it is only through this interaction of culture, history, place, and political economy that technologies sort of come into being. And actually, much of what we know about AI comes through its visual metaphors. There's Hans Morowicz's Rising Sea of Intelligence, kind of worked on by Max Tegmark. There's metaphors for big data. There's the neural network zoo that we see a lot of today. And actually, this is just like a visual representation of mathematical functions. And we come to believe that this is actually what AI is, and this is what underlies it. So neural itself, sort of suggests the brain, which is a metaphor that we cannot get out of at this point. We use metaphors to describe things that elude our grasp just a little bit. The word metaphora, the Greek word metaphora, from which we get metaphor, is something that's written on the backs of most trucks in Greece because it literally means to transport. But metaphors are more than just transportation. They are also the road, the map, and the destination. Metaphors can slip into common parlance, easily making us forget that they are indeed just metaphors. So they can be misleading, but they can also work as self-fulfilling prophecies. And if AI is multiple and uncertain and shaped by language and culture, then what do metaphors offer up as the possibility for other ways of thinking about this technology? And as feminist epistemologist Sandra Harding reminds us, all metaphors also carry a social fingerprint. As much as we think that language just sort of arrives, it actually doesn't. There is a real sort of history and place to where and how certain kinds of words and language become popular and take hold. So we have to become attentive to who's coming up with the metaverse and from where. So language always matters because it structures and brings worlds into being. And metaphoric speech sort of houses, but also limits our understanding of these worlds. So the work that AI metaphors do is they also shape the progression of this field as generating knowledge about what we think humans are and what we think human intelligence is in an attempt to replicate it. And I think this is a question that we have to keep coming back to. And at this point, I'm going to actually hand over to Mushon, and I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Mushon, and then we can talk a little bit more later.
Yeah, so I'll continue directly so we can get to the conversation as soon as possible. And I'm going to start from one of the examples that I suggested to Maya for AI metaphors coming from Israel. It was one of three. Specifically, I was looking at Waze for several reasons. Waze was kind of the poster child of the Israeli tech scene. It was like the big exit when Google bought it in 2013. And Waze has developed kind of a very intimate relationship with its users, specifically the Israeli users, who were also the first users of the system. So Waze is a navigation app, and what you're seeing here is some of the icons of the Wazers. These are different representations for the users on the Waze map, but they're also a representation of Waze itself. So kind of the pop kind of cutesy framing of what this system is has been something that Waze had from the get-go, and it was always interesting to me to try to refer to how do people how do users think about Waze, and they think about Waze as many things, as it, as he, as she, as they, but very, very rarely as a robot, right? It's not really considered as this AI system. very much because of the, like, everybody understands that it is an AI system, but it's not referred to that colloquially. And colloquially is actually a very, it's something that happens a lot because it's there in the car, right? So it didn't take me too long to find an opportunity to record the example that I had in mind. So I've recorded a conversation between me and my partner as we were driving. So let's listen to that.
הופה, 28.
מה יש לו ווייז הזה לפעמים?
Okay, so what happened here exactly? This is the moment that I think happens a lot with navigation systems. And it's the moment that I want to talk about. So I'll break it down to steps. It starts with, we obviously need to take a left on the, a left on the intersection. But for some reason, Waze asks us to take a right. And obviously it is going to send us back on the other direction later. So doubt is the first response. And then disobedience. So instead of turning a right, I'm continuing straight. And this is the moment of drama. Did I make the mistake of my life and I'm going to pay for it? Or would I be rewarded for my independence? In this case, it was like a catharsis, right? But there were three options here. One would have been punishment if the ETA, the estimated time of arrival, would have been higher than it was before. Another option would have been 1830, like the exact same time. I knew it. I'm free to do whatever I want. It's exactly the same thing. And the third option would be like Galia, my partner, was saying, what is it with Waze sometimes? And the thing that is with Waze sometimes is that Waze has a different perspective of the network than we do, as mere subjects, mere ends in the flow, right? And Waze probably knows that if it would send everybody in what is currently the fastest path, then it would not be the fastest path anymore. So it has a more nuanced and complex perspective of the network diagram of transportation. But that is obviously not something that it would be able to communicate to us, or something that we care about necessarily, because we don't have the responsibility over the network itself the way we have the interest in to just get there as soon as possible. So this moment of recalculating path, recalculating route is a very specific one. It's a moment of negotiating the authority. The algorithm tells you where you should go, but it's always a recommendation. It's not a self-driving car yet. It's a decision support system, right? So in the 0 to 5 grades that Maya presented, it's still 0. But all of the network analysis does happen in the background, at least on a very basic level. So prediction is a suggestion, and then but it's immediately scrutinized. So I can actually disobey or refuse that suggestion and would get immediate feedback. So it's non-deterministic. I can actually constantly test it. And we have a power dynamic between the driver and the algorithm. Now, when there's another person in the car, then the power dynamics becomes a bit more complex. There's me and the algorithm in a conversation. There's my partner and the algorithm in a conversation, and there's me and my partner in the conversation. So it's two people in the car, and we already have group dynamics. So, and that happens all the time. So that element of negotiation, of authority, like of who holds the wheel, the algorithm, my wife or myself, is an ongoing issue when we're driving together, all three of us. I'll just one last thing and one last thought about this metaphor of recalculating route. Recalculating route, or the way it's called in Hebrew, mechashev maslul mechadash, has become a trope or actually a meme in Israeli culture, and I could easily find four books that are titled Recalculating Route. One of them is for travel, two of them are self-help, and another one is for religious bent political thought. Recalculating Route. I could find a song, two TV series, and obviously endless political memes. So this whole idea of recalculating route as a system receiving new information, and then after a process of reflection, choosing a new path, is becoming this really interesting metaphor on metaphor, right? It's a metaphor of the AI, and then it becomes a metaphor for other things. So I think I'll stop here, and let's have a conversation, Maya.
Hi, Mushon, thank you. Okay, so can I just get a sense of how much time we have left?
Sure. We have about, we'll be generous because we started late, so probably about 20 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's great. And we can have a chat, and then we can also respond to some questions in that time. Yeah.
Sounds perfect. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm noticing that I'm just kind of wondering what is the order in which to do this, because there are some specific questions I'm seeing about that are specific to the talk itself, to what we both talked about. Does it make sense to do that?
No, let's start the two of us, Maya.
Okay.
So, yeah. So I think I think it would be interesting to expand on maybe something, some of the grades that you presented, the grades of autonomy, and then maybe try to connect the grades of autonomy that I was referring to as well. Because even in this very, very low automation or no automation, basically, we're already seeing these conflicts of authority. I wonder what is like the cultural shift that needs to happen for us to give up the control even further.
I mean, that's really interesting, but it's also like a very deep question, because it relates to how we even imagine what this technology is. We think that it's actually still a car, and there is, and the story you told, I think, is this great sort of story of how we are integrating these technologies into our everyday lives and actually kind of like making it in that very moment into something that's not quite a car, but is still a car. And I feel that kind of discomfort, that cognitive discomfort that, I don't know, that is always apparent to me in these sorts of moments, that I think that that's actually how things always are, and that we have to always stay with. I don't know that I comfortable with that linear scale. But I realized that it is important for engineers and designers to sort of think about things like regulation and decision making and where the buck stops. In the case of conflicts, like the one that you talked about, but then it's much more complex when it becomes a life or death situation. And the cases of crashes that have already happened with driverless cars, or sort of emergent driverless cars, show that eventually it is actually the human who is always responsible so far for things that go wrong, because while it's supposed to be much more computationally competent than the human, the machine cannot be held responsible. And to sort of identify where and how to think about that accountability, we kind of use very older frames of things like the law or existing automobile regulation. So every time you sort of go one step, you sort of like do one part of the handover, you also have to go back and think about that uncomfortable moment of what this technology is as something that's multiple. So I'm personally actually really okay with that discomfort, because I feel like that is how we sort of interact with and negotiate our everyday lives with so many technologies around us. There is a fantasy that's very much about, with the car, that's very much about just this ease of, it will just do things for you. I don't know if that makes entire sense in response to your question, but tell me what you think.
Yeah, I think as you were speaking, I was reminded of a panel I moderated last week where this example was brought up by a German guy working on AI in the military, and specifically in the context of fighter jets, and then we started to discuss this question about who's responsible for collateral damage, and this is a very popular kind of Wired magazine-ish question when it comes to self-driving cars, but when we compare it to the case of fighter jets, specifically in a conversation between Germans and Israelis, actually, the question of who's responsible for dropping the bomb or for a car crash in our case. It's not like right now we have a system where authority is very, very clear. Like with fighter pilots, the fighter pilot is a human at the moment, and it is a human that actually pulls the trigger. But they pull the trigger because there's an intelligence system behind them, an intelligence system that is wide. Some of it is automated, but it's not relevant. At the end of the day, there's something very, very convenient for us that we have human agency and human accountability at the end of that chain. But that's a fallacy, right? That's just like, we need someone to blame, so it might as well be the last person in the loop. But how does culture wrap itself around the idea that actually already exists, that we don't have this very, very clear one person kind of to stop the dam, right?
No, we don't. And I think, in words like up the chain and the loop, there's actually a lot of ideas that kind of implicate actually the law and how we imagine singular individuals, the human being responsible and taking responsibility, or this idea of things going up the chain. We see this now in conversations around big tech as well. When we have people with inordinate amounts of wealth and power and control, maybe it's possible to identify single individuals and their sort of ambitions and visions. But I think quite a lot about how that narrative makes it really difficult for us to think about other systems Using words like distributed and relational are things that, I mean, it's very much in vogue now. Many of us do it. But I think in the systems that exist, they have always been distributed and relational. Accident accountability that comes from, let's say, aviation is legendary in sort of shaping a lot of these industries and showing that there is no singular moment of culpability. And it's about all of these systems having their own, being sort of systems of infrastructural accountability within themselves. But there's something about this idea of how we think about autonomy and robots and this self-driving. And that's why I'm so sort of always stuck with the language and hung up on the language. We imagine that it must make those decisions locally, or that they must be identified in a certain way, because we think of the driver as changing, not as driving as changing. You know, and I think that that's actually the shift that has to happen, that what driving and mobility actually mean, and not that, oh, this was the driver and now this is the driver, you know, that shift between human and machine, and even that kind of dyadic relationship. It's a really hard conversation to have, and even harder to sort of actualize. But this is why I think the work of artists and cultural producers and designers is so important, in being able to say, what's another way to imagine some of these, and be reflective and reflexive about, you know, and intentional about how we're thinking about those systems of responsibility or accountability and response in these contexts, especially when there are crashes involved. But what tends to happen, I think, is we just end up having more automated decision making to regulate automated decision making. So I'll finally just kind of like say something about that, the fighter pilot situation as well, that I think I don't think it can be that simple, but it's plugged into the system of the way the military always has functioned in terms of singular individuals being responsible. And I think that there is no person behind. The person is part of a network-centric intelligence and decision making. So anyway, I'm going to stop there because I can rant on about this stuff.
So to continue from where you're taking this, it's like, if I go back to this to this negotiation between Waze, myself, my partner, especially the way the metaphor that Waze created for the AI, that did not frame it as a machine or as a network, but as an entity. I really feel, on one hand, made the experience, if we're talking about user experience, made it much more human, but it is not human, and so it's very much this is a good user experience that is based on a lie, or on kind of I'm blanking on the term, but
not a deception,
idea of
deception, or
it's like it's almost self-deception, because you know what's going on, but you're playing along with the system, because it is you as a driver. And the other system is not another driver. The closest thing it would be is a map. So you're not either you driving the map or the algorithm driving the map. It's you driving the car or the map driving the car, and it's obviously not just a map. It's a network. So it's a network diagram. And the way that it sees a system, and the way that it drives at the same time, not only your car but every other car that is connected to the network, creates this mismatch of knowing and language that is just like that is a huge. I think it's a huge cognitive gap. At the same time, the map, as we know, is not the territory. So it's not like not like there's the truth that the map knows because it knows more than you do, and there's your single limited perspective as a driver. It's three things, and as always, the territory kind of disappears. But when it comes back to a car crash, right, that exposes that exposes all layers of misreading, right? What's supposed to be the common ground. I think then all of a sudden we kind of cling to our guns and say, oh, who's responsible here, right?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the crash is, and the map point, which is very implicated in crashes as well. There is no distinction between map and territory when it comes to a driverless car or many of these systems. The map is the territory because there's nothing else. It's only what the driverless car perceives and understands as the map that it's been given. There's nothing else sort of beyond that. So it's only kind of making decisions within that world. And one of the kind of famous crash cases that has been written about a lot, many of us have written about this, is the one in Florida where the test driver was killed because the driverless car's computer vision system mistook the light white side of a 16-wheel truck for the early Florida dawn sky. And this was not it was statistical decision making made inside that system that misconstrued one thing for the other, because it doesn't actually know what is the side of a truck and what is the sky. It is, John Cheney-Lippold has this great phrase that I've actually referenced in my paper, and is not coming to me now, but it's basically, the ontology basically of the sky and of the tractor trailer, the side of the truck, are sort of, they're statistics at this point, it's data science at this point. So it doesn't matter what they really are. And I think that's kind of where the problem sort of arises when we want to sort of say, this is something that can be understood through our frames of language and representation and meaning making, and how we know the world, when actually this is not at all how algorithmic systems know the world, not just operating in different ways. So to even think about then, what does regulation mean for that, is where then we come into the black box and systems of transparency and accountability. And can we ask a sort of black box to account for itself? No, of course not. But then this is then it becomes like, okay, can we talk to the computer scientists or people who engineer that black box to sort of build in accountability mechanisms to it? But I think it's actually precisely the kinds of existing systems that we have that kind of keep asking questions about how do we seek accountability for these systems that are architected in such a distributed way, and not just keep putting it back on the most marginalized human. In many cases, it's actually the test driver, who, rather than the car company, that is responsible. So I feel like there's a kind of default back to older ways of doing things and older institutions. My general rant on this, and the last thing I'll say before we kind of move on, is that I feel there's many institutional systems and structures within 20th century thinking, within modernity, that have kind of birthed many of these technologies, from AI to the driver to the car. Many of those institutional frameworks that don't quite work anymore or need to be updated in some way. And so in sort of understanding now how automated decision-making works differently from human decision-making, and it's not an exact sort of match between human and machine. So these handovers of human and machine are always going to have like gaps and be very glitchy between them. Indeed, we have never been more modern. We've never been modern. I don't know, should we just keep doing this, or do we have good questions? Or?
Well, it's good that you've come to a natural pause, Maya.
It's not a natural pause.
Yes, it was. If it's all right with you two, I'd love to open it up a bit for
Yes,
the last
please.
10 minutes. There's loads of things that have come up in the chat here. I'm asking Al to ignore mine because they're just troublemaking. So Al, over to you.
Yeah, first of all, I would like that to continue into the rest of our lives, if we could do that, John. If I can ignore the troublemaking questions. So we have the first question from Kristen, which is, how does the algorithm consider the implications of how safe a route is? And she makes the observation that surely there's ethical implications determining what's safe versus what is dangerous. Shall I put that in the chat again? There's quite a lot in there, isn't there?
I'll do it, Al.
it in
thanks.
the Q&A. I think if we, Mushon can talk about Waze, but I think that if we reframe safety in terms of what is it optimizing for, so even this idea of what is safe or what is ethical are things that I think people want to translate into, frameworks for decision making that will then optimize for certain kinds of routes, certain kinds of places to inhabit or go through in the city, which then has implications for those places. So there's stories about people actually trying to subvert Waze by changing stop signs or changing sort of the landscape of where they live because they want to confuse Waze and not have traffic routed through their areas. Or you have people who live in places that are deemed dangerous or unsafe because of all kinds of other indicators like historic marginalization, and the software is optimized to avoid those areas. So those people may not be able to get Ubers or something like that, in that context. But maybe Mushon wants to say more about safety.
Yeah, just to continue and to further complexify that point, in Israel, there was quite a political political tension around whether Waze would route you through the occupied territories, because as an Israeli driver, you're definitely free to ride these roads, but many drivers prefer not to, both for political reasons or for perceived safety reasons, and that has put Waze in a position of taking sides, which it went back and forth on. I don't remember where did it stop or whether it ever stopped, but this idea of like what is a legitimate road and what is a legitimate path beyond like the physics when you expose to politics and the sociology and the urbanism and all of these layers, which are like the sky, right? Irrelevant for the AI, but super relevant for us humans exploring the world, right?
Yeah, almost like sort of micro-territorialization. It becomes so dense and so much negotiation that needs to take place. Thank you both. We have a short one from Danny Garcia, which would be, should we give the control any further, though?
Should we give the control? So I'll just, I want to reflect on the wording. So there's a we, there's a give. So it implies that there's a we that makes a decision together, and that the control exists within the we. Both of that is at least contested. I think there are many we's and many controls, right? I actually don't think that we are the best drivers, and I actually think that specifically driving would be able to be like it's reasonable to think that machines would be able to do a better job than we do, but I think in the process so many things need to happen. So and they have to do with accountability. They have to do with planning. They have to do with this systemizing. So I think in a way the discussion is so much focused on what the machine can do with the car and the road, as if when the car meets the road, that's like the main challenge. I don't think that's the main challenge. I think the main challenge is what happens when the network or the map meets the territory in a way, right? I think that's where the tension is much bigger, and I don't think we're doing much work on that. But when we do work on that, I think that would expose much more, and that's why I think driverless cars are such. And maybe if we're talking about metaphor and language, even that terminology, driverless cars, it kind of focuses that on like the wonder of look, mommy, no hands. That's not the issue. But then we'll need to look pretty much on every instance of this mismatch between the map and the territory, and that's like a kind of worms.
Maya, did you want to come in there? Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. I think also the issue is, I mentioned this automobile autonomous vehicle readiness index that's made up by KPMG, which is like supposed to support policymakers. And what that index is actually saying is that actually autonomous driving is environmental and it's infrastructural and it's about the urban space. So yes, there is this sort of gap constantly between human and machine, which is as old as time, and how we sort of productively fill that is the work that many of us do and experience. But I think that there's in responding to this there's actually many other ways to sort of think about what that question means, because do we give more control, as Mushon was saying, there's a very specific sort of linearity in that. But I think that it's actually, if we started asking a wider set of questions, like one of the things that really gets talked about in the context of AI is things like data privacy. Or, surveillance capitalism is talked about a lot, but actually lots of movements and histories of people talking about the trade in data, the harvesting and collection of data, issues around data protection and privacy, they don't become part of this conversation always. There's some research about, sort of privacy and driverless cars and things like that. But the fact that it is actually much more about the world around the robot that has to keep changing for it is, I think, takes away and sort of makes us sort of look at different points of where we want to act or ask questions rather than this sort of, giving up control, because at some level it's already kind of out there. Lots of control is constantly being given up, but also being negotiated and brought back. I kind of want to also keep remembering that it's also possible for us to make decisions in those moments.
But I think the reason why the case of autonomous vehicles is so interesting is because that exposes the exact divide. Because there's the decisions that we make based on the local information that we have, and if we talked about like man versus machine for a very long time was a local decision. The machine was there, we could see the mechanics and so on, but the fact that even and I haven't mentioned it until now, but 7 years ago I designed the maps for Waze, so I got the experience to deal with some of these questions firsthand. But even the idea of what do we show within the small frame of the phone as the space that not only echoes, it shows the map of the territory, but also shows how is this map thought about through how does Waze think about this map. It was never enough to bridge that divide, and I think that divide would not be breached very soon. What would need to change, and in a way what Silicon Valley as like the moniker for privileged tech wants us to think is that, okay, you can't get it, so just like change the way you're thinking about this. But this moment of transition is a moment where we need to. It is very much about agency. It's very much about what kind of control we need to give or to keep, and that's more about like how do we want to redefine this conversation between between automation and who gets to automate, how do they get to automate, and the agency that is still based on our human perception, on our local situated understanding of space. Yeah, and it's 3 p.m. GMT. So I think.
Thanks, Mushon, and thanks, Maya. Wrapped up neatly on the hour, which just pleases me enormously. That was just so generous of you. Wonderful. It just raises so many questions for us that are is exactly what perhaps we would hope to come out of a conversation of this kind. And I think it's also very relevant to what we're all trying to do on MAUX, which is not necessarily to answer these questions, but maybe to address, externalize, or express them in a way that is more widely distributable than some of the technologies that give rise to these questions. So I want to give a really, really big thanks for that. And to everyone who's participating on the chat here. We're going to move on pretty quickly with Laura Folano and Dan Lockton. So yeah, big thanks, guys. Thank you so much. And Maya, I hope it's not too late in the evening now.
No, it's great. I'm going to be listening in. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Hey guys, thank you.
Thanks, Mushon.